Hey everybody, this is the first chapter of Ernest Mandel's The Formation of the Economic Thought of Karl Marx, 1843 to Capital. There is no introduction to this book, just a first chapter. So I'm just going to read the first chapter. I don't know how much of this book I'll get through in any kind of timely fashion, but I told myself that I'm going to read a bunch of introductions to books about Marx, just to get a feel for some of the general arguments that have been made about him, about his work at least. The table of contents for this book are: 1. From the critique of private property to the critique of capitalism. 2. From condemning capitalism to providing a socio-economic vindication of communism. 3. From rejection to acceptance of the labor theory of value. 4. A first general analysis of the capitalist mode of production. 5. The problem of periodic crises. 6. Perfecting the theory of value, the theory of surplus value, and the theory of money. 7. The Grundrisse, or the dialectics of labor time and free time. 8. The Asiatic mode of production and the historical preconditions for the rise of capital. 9. The final shaping of the theory of wages. 10. From the economic and philosophic manuscripts to the Grundrisse, from an anthropological to a historical conception of alienation. 11. Progressive disalienation through the building of socialist society, or inevitable alienation in industrial society? ? Bibliography. Chapter 1 is titled From the Critique of Private Property to the Critique of Capitalism. Here we go. Marx and Engels did not travel the same route to arrive at the ideas they came to share. Quote, they had in common the same philosophical starting point, namely Hegel's dialectics, Bruno and Bauer's, quote, self-consciousness, and Feuerbach's humanism. Marx and Engels then made the acquaintance of British and French socialism. But whereas this became for Marx the means whereby he ordered his thoughts regarding the struggles and aspirations of his epoch, for Engels the same role was played by British industry. End quote. Franz Mehring. This difference resulted, no doubt, from differences in character and temperament, the more speculative nature of Marx's genius, the greater impetuousness of Engels. Chance and material circumstances also played a part, however. While Marx emigrated from Germany to France, Engels was sent to England to learn the conduct of business affairs, and there came into contact with the reality of large-scale capitalist industry. It was the shock of this encounter with the contradictions of bourgeois society that was to decide the course of his thinking for the rest of his life. Footnote. Quote, while in Manchester it was tangibly brought home to me that the economic facts, which have so far played no role or only a contemptible role in the writing of history, are, at least in the modern world, a decisive historical force, that they form the basis for the origin of the present-day class antagonism, that these class antagonisms in the countries they have become fully developed, thanks to large-scale industry, hence especially in England, are in their turn the basis of the formation of political parties and of party struggles, and thus of all political history, end quote. Frederick Engels. On the History of the Communist League, published in Marx and Engels Selected Works, Volume 3, the piece was written as an introduction to the 1885 German edition of Marx's pamphlet, Revelations about the Cologne Communist Trial. End footnote. If Marx developed, almost unaided, the entire economic, quote, panel, end quote, of Marx's theory, it is to Engels that the credit is due for having been the first to urge Marx to take up the study of political economy and for having grasped, in a, quote, brilliant sketch, end quote, the central importance of this science for communism. Footnote: Marx expresses this opinion of the outlines of a critique of political economy in his preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. End footnote. This, quote, sketch written at the end of 1843 was the first economic work by either of the two friends. Ryazanov correctly ascribes it a, quote, very great importance in the history of the development, bracket, of the beginnings, end bracket, of Marxism, end quote. Ryazanov. It must be emphasized that it was also Engels who, though 2 years Marx's junior, was the first to declare himself openly a communist and to regard as necessary and inevitable a radical revolution which would abolish private property. As early as the end of 1842, when he was only just 22, Engels ended an article on the Prussian monarchy by predicting a bourgeois revolution and began an article in Britain by announcing the approach of a social revolution. At the same time, in an article published in the Rheinische Zeitung, Der Kommunismus und die Augsburger Allgemeine Zeitung, Marx was still rejecting communism while stressing the need to study it thoroughly in order to be able to criticize it adequately. Nevertheless, the two founders of scientific socialism were already attacking the problem from the same angle, by criticizing the neo-Hegelian conception of the state, by discovering the existence of social classes, and by analyzing the inhuman effects of private property and competition. We are able in both cases to follow the trajectory of their thinking from point to point, from criticism of religion to criticism of philosophy, from criticism of philosophy to criticism of the state, from criticism of the state to the criticism of society. That is, from criticism of politics to criticism of political economy, which led to criticism of private property. Sorry, I forgot to look up when this book was written. It doesn't say. At least not in any place, not in the front pages anyway. With Marx, however, the purely theoretical aspect was to remain predominant throughout this period, and the evolution of Marxist thought was to result in the introduction to the critique of the Hegelian philosophy of right from the end of 1843 and beginning of 1844. With Engels, it was the practical aspect, the criticism of British bourgeois society, that took the ascendancy, both in the outlines of a critique of political economy and in Die Lage Englands, the condition of England, which appeared in the journal Deutsch Französische Jahrbucher at the same time as Marx's well-known critique. It is generally accepted that Marx took little interest in political economy during his university studies. The list that has come down to us of the books he studied while at Berlin University does not include a single one devoted to this subject. In a letter of September 28, 1892 to Franz Mehring, Engels, discussing Marx's years at the universities of Bonn and Berlin, writes, quote, "He knew nothing whatever about political economy, ... end quote. Nevertheless, Pierre Neville is right in seeking to mitigate the excessively hard and fast character of this view. In fact, Hegel himself had been profoundly affected in his youth by economic studies, in particular by the work of Adam Smith. Marx saw the Hegelian system as a veritable philosophy of labor. Footnote: it was Plekhanov who first emphasized the importance of Hegel as a precursor of historical materialism. By his, according to economic development, a central place in the expansion of what is specific in each nation or civilization. The relevant articles by Plekhanov appeared in 1891 in Die Neue Zeit and were reprinted in Revue Internationale, number 22, April-June 1950. In his masterly work, Der junge Hegel, Georg Lukács studied in detail the economic ideas of the young Hegel. In particular, he showed the central position occupied by labor in Hegelian anthropology. Hegel wrote in 1803 to 1804, quote, "The greater the extent to which labor is carried on with the help of machinery, the less is its value and the longer it has to be carried on in this way," end quote. Hegel. This sentence constitutes a brilliant anticipation of what Marx and Engels were to write 40 years later. Nor should it be forgotten that in Hegel's logic, labor is the original form of praxis. We shall return to the problem of Hegel's economic ideas in Chapter 10. End footnote. Quote, "When we read the phenomenology of mind, the philosophy of right, and even the science of logic, Marx thus not only discovered Hegel, but already through him was aware of that part of classical political economy which was assimilated and translated into philosophical terms in Hegel's work, so that Marx would not have gone about his systematic criticism of civil society and the state according to Hegel if he had not already found in the latter's writings certain elements which were still alive, such as the theory of needs, the theory of appropriation, or the analysis of the division of labor." End quote. Pierre Neville. Marx had already moved from philosophy to politics, the first step in his intellectual development, when he became editor of the Rheinische Zeitung in 1842. His fundamental position continued to be one of struggle for a, quote, "human state." Marx still took his stand on, quote, "human rights," and, quote, "in general, on the struggle against feudal survivals. Like Hegel, Marx considered that the state should be, quote, "the realization of freedom," end quote. Paul Kagi. But even at this stage, Marx had discovered a contradiction between this ideal notion of the state and the fact that the Stände, parenthesis, estates, end parenthesis, represented in the provincial Diet of the Rhineland, strove to, quote, "drag the state down to the level of the idea of private interest," end quote. Marx. In other words, as soon as he tackled a current political problem, namely the new law on the theft of wood, Marx came up against the problem of social classes. The state, which ought to embody the, quote, "general interest," end quote, seemed to be acting merely on behalf of private property, and in order to do this was violating not only the logic of law, but even some obvious principles of humanity. Marx had already grasped that private property, to the defense of which the state seemed to wish to devote itself exclusively, resulted from a private monopolistic appropriation of a common asset. And Marx perceived in a penal provision which assigned the labor of the thief to the owner of the wood, in order to compensate him for his losses, the chief key to his future theory of surplus value. Unpaid forced labor is the source of, quote, "percentages," end quote, that is, of interest and of profit. From the first entry into the subject, a political critique then led the young Marx to the threshold of a criticism of, quote, "civil society," end quote, a criticism of political economy. Footnote. Marx himself wrote on this subject, quote, "In the years 1842 to 43, as editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, I experienced for the first time the embarrassment of having to take part in discussions on so-called material interests. The proceedings of the Rhenish Landtag, of thefts of wood and parceling of landed property, the official polemic which Herr von Schapper, then Oberpräsident of the Rhine province, opened against the Rheinische Zeitung on the conditions of the Moselle peasantry, and finally debates on free trade and protective tariffs provided the first occasions for occupying myself with economic questions," end quote. Marx. preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. End footnote. Before crossing this threshold, however, and immersing himself in the subject that was to be the chief preoccupation of his life as a scholar, he seemed to feel a constant need to look back, to retrace his steps, to make sure he had not missed any alternative solution, and to settle finally with all the ideologies he had just outgrown. During the 2 years between October 1842, when he began his articles on the Debatten über das Holzdiebstahlgesetz, debates on the law against the stealing of wood, and the beginning of his studies in political economy, undertaken in Paris, the young Marx was to draw up a balance sheet of the two movements, Hegelian philosophy and utopian socialism, that he had to transcend before he could give his own ideas of a definite form. The term, quote, transcend, must be understood here in its Hegelian dialectical sense, which implies that all that is valid in the positions transcended remains preserved in the new positions. In order to help understand how the young Marx's economic ideas evolved, it is interesting to trace the origins of his concern with social questions. Having first discovered their existence through the poverty of the Mosella vine growers and the debates about the wood thieves, Marx began to run into them at every step. As he started on a detailed... I'll notice something weird here. Oh, fuck. The text is kind of cut off. God damn it. I'm sorry. And every step, as he started on a detailed criticism of Hegel's philosophy, he found that, quote, the estate of direct labor, end quote, parenthesis, der Stand der unmittelbaren Arbeit, that is, the mass of those who own nothing, in fact forms the precondition for the existence of bourgeois society. Footnote. Gunther Hillmann says that Marx's first encounter with the problem of private property was also a personal encounter. As editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, it seems that he came into conflict with attempts by a group of shareholders to save the paper from being banned by the censors by making political concessions. End footnote. And to this, quote, artificially caused poverty, end quote, he counterposed enjoyment as the true aim of mankind. Writing to Ruge, the publisher of the Deutsch Französische Jahrbucher, Marx declared that, quote, from this conflict of the political state with itself, one can everywhere deduce the truth about society, end quote. Marx. Nevertheless, while proclaiming himself already an opponent of private property, which he described in his criticism of the theory and practice of law as the source of all injustice, he still declined to call himself a communist. Marx's study of problems of the philosophy of the state led him to read Rousseau, Montesquieu, Machiavelli, and especially a number of historians of the French Revolution, who influenced him profoundly and led him to study French socialism, offspring of the tendencies which the revolution had set free. His last rejection of communism is to be found in the above-quoted letter to Ruge dated September 1843, and his first profession of faith as a communist is dated March 1844. Between these two dates, a political evolution took place which was to be definitive for the rest of his life. Footnote. See Kagi, Genesis des historischen Materialismus. In his ingenious research to find the exact moment Marx went over to socialism, Kagi has forgotten to draw on a source of major importance, the biographical note on Marx which Engels wrote for the Handwörterbuch der Staatswissenschaften, Volume 6. There, Engels notes that it was after his arrival in Paris that Marx became a socialist, thanks to his study of political economy, of the French socialists, and of the history of France. End footnote. What was the decisive factor in this evolution? It is hard to isolate an element in a number of influences, But however important his reading of such writers as Moses Hess, whose influence is undeniable, or his study of the French Revolution may have been, it was the overall climate of French society under Louis Philippe, the seething of progressive ideas, the activity of the various socialist sects, the first contact that he made in real life with the working class, and the situation of the proletariat that made it possible for the literary influences to crystallize. Footnote: Auguste Cornu correctly stresses the social and historical setting as a factor determining Marx's development, whereas Eric Thier plainly exaggerates the influence of Moses Hess. End footnote. In his first article on the Jewish question, Marx had already set himself the task of examining the relationship between political emancipation and human emancipation in general, the logical conclusion to his criticism of constitutional theories of politics. In passing, Marx links money with private property as the source of human alienation. But at the same time, he reveals labor, the worker, the proletarian, as the embodiment of that alienated mankind which has to be emancipated. And in his introduction to the critique of the Hegelian philosophy of right, he was to make the proletariat the author of its own self-emancipation, which thereby became the emancipation of mankind as a whole. Marx had become aware that, quote, the relationship between industry and the world of wealth in general and the political world is a major problem of the modern age, end quote. Marx. This relationship, however, though grasped and criticized theoretically, can be changed only by practice. Footnote: this idea undoubtedly came from Hess, whose Philosophie der Tat, Philosophy of Action, had appeared in October 1843 in a symposium edited by Georg Herweg entitled 21 Bogen aus der Schweiz. End footnote. But while the, quote, weapon of criticism cannot replace the criticism of weapons, end quote, quote, theory itself becomes a material force when theory takes hold of the masses, end quote. Marx. And these masses were the proletarian masses whose emergence made a German revolution possible. Such a revolution could not be a radical revolution. It could not be confined to the political bourgeois sphere. Quote, the positive possibility of German emancipation, end quote, depended precisely upon the formation of a class, quote, in radical chains, end quote, which in striving to cast off these claims would reject all social chains by abolishing private property. Quote, when the proletariat desires the negation of private property, it is merely elevating to a general principle of society what it already involuntarily embodies in itself as the negative product of society. End quote. Marx. To be sure, this discovery of the revolutionary role of the proletariat as negator of private property was still confined within philosophical limits and was not yet freed of a certain sentimental humanism, Feuerbach's anthropological principle. Engels was to say later that Feuerbach's humanism takes as Feuerbach's humanism's point of departure an abstract man outside of society, since the world, the concrete social conditions in which this man lives, is never discussed. The proletariat situation was condemned as, quote, unjust, end quote, as based on injustice, as immoral. Following Feuerbach, Marx still declared that while the proletariat was the heart of human emancipation, philosophy was its head. He had not yet grasped that the position occupied by the proletariat in the production process was the basis of its power to emancipate. He had not yet grasped that a certain level of development of the productive forces, that the realization of certain material conditions, were indispensable if communism was to be achieved. Marx's communism was still essentially philosophical. Nevertheless, the link between this philosophical communism and the proletariat was now firmly established. From here to the study of the, quote, real movement of emancipation, end quote, the proletariat, French, British, and German socialism and communism, required only one step, which Marx took at the very beginning of his exile in Paris. The transition from philosophical to proletarian communism was made without serious difficulty. Engels arrived at communism before Marx, as already said, but Engels' communism too was at first in essence clearly philosophical. It was even a communism that addressed itself first and foremost to the enlightened bourgeoisie and to the intellectuals, as can be seen from the many articles on the communist movement on the continent, which Engels wrote at the end of 1843 and the beginning of 1804 for the Owenite weekly, The New Moral World. Quote, we, bracket, i.e. the German communists, end bracket, can recruit our ranks from those classes only which have enjoyed a pretty good education, end quote, Engels declared. And Engels counterposed philosophical communism to the communism of the toiling masses as embodied in Weitling's communist movement. Engels understood, however, that communism is the necessary outcome of the social conditions created by modern civilization. This is why Engels described the parallelism of the communist movement in Britain, France, and Germany, including German-speaking Switzerland. Quote, thus, the three great civilized countries of Europe, England, France, and Germany have all come to the conclusion that a thorough revolution in social arrangements based on community of property has now become an urgent and unavoidable necessity. ... The English came to this conclusion practically. by the rapid increase of misery, demoralization, and pauperism in their own country. The French politically, by first asking for political liberty and equality, and finding this insufficient, joining social liberty and social equality to their political claims. The Germans became communist philosophically. By reasoning upon first principles, end quote. Engels, published in The New Moral World, 4th of November, 1843. It must be stressed that Marx and Engels formulated practically at the same moment the fundamental program of the proletarian social revolution, namely the abolition of private property. In Marx, in his Introduction to the Critique of the Hegelian Philosophy of Right, Engels in his articles for the New Moral World and writings dated between November 1843 and January 1844, doubtless independently of each other, it is also worth emphasizing the brilliant insight shown by the young Engels when, in a single phase, he summed up the respective contributions to be made by the three great nations of Western Europe to the world labor movement of the 19th century. Britain would contribute to the practical success of the first mass organizations, Chartism and trade unionism. France, the revolutionary struggle for the conquest of political power, a struggle which began with the tradition laid down by the French Revolution, passed through Babeuf, Blanqui, and June 1848 and culminated in the Paris Commune, the first effective conquest of power by the proletariat. And Germany, the theoretical perfecting of this first scientific socialist program. Of course, when he wrote this last, he was unaware of the decisive part he himself was to play in working out Germany's theoretical contribution to the proletarian movement through his preparatory work for and his share in the writing of the Communist Manifesto. As we have said, it was the shock caused by his confrontation in Britain with the actual proletariat, produced by large-scale industry, with its poverty and demoralization, but also its formidable collective power and organizing capacity. Engels noted with admiration that the Chartists were able to collect 1,000,000 pennies every week. Its fighting spirit and its power to lift itself spiritually and morally above its material wretchedness as soon as it organized itself. That enabled Engels to go forward from philosophical communism to proletarian communism. Ryazanov recalls oppositely that Engels' meeting with the first real proletarian communists, the German Schaper, Bauer, and Moll, who had emigrated to London, made a tremendous impression on him, one which indeed he himself described in his introduction to Marx's Revelations about the Cologne Communist trial. And we sense the effect of this practical experience in the three works that were to mark this transition: Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy, end of 1843, Die Lage Englands, or The Conditions in England, January 1844, and wait, I guess this is different. I don't know. Die Lage Englands, January 1844, and The Condition of the Working Class in England, end of 1844, beginning of 1845. The first of these, 3, The Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy, is, as we noted, the first strictly economic work by either of the two friends. Engels says nothing substantially new in it. Engels criticizes economic liberalism, the doctrine of Adam Smith, Ricardo, and McCulloch, by confronting it with the economic and social reality of industrial Britain. This criticism was to a large extent inspired by such socialist writers as Owen, Fourier, and Proudhon, but goes beyond them in its fruitful application of Hegelian dialectics to social reality. And though it is still dominated by a number of moralizing and idealistic conceptions, condemning trade for causing, quote, mutual distrust, and, quote, using, quote, immoral means to attain an immoral end, end quote, is nevertheless marked by some remarkable insights that were later to find echoes in Marx's work, in the Communist Manifesto, and even in the Grundrisse. For example, the idea that capitalist economy is a step forward, necessary, quote, for all these petty local and national considerations to recede into the background, so that the struggle of our time could become a universal human struggle, end quote. Footnote. Emile Battigelli correctly observes, however, that this moral condemnation of trade, competition, etc. is based on Feuerbach's humanistic principle, which is combined with the Hegelian philosophy of history. We thus have an attempt to integrate criticism of history, society, and the economy, which can perhaps be seen as a stage in the preparation of the economic and philosophic manuscripts and the German ideology. End footnote. The starting point of the Outlines by Engels is a criticism of trade, of the mercantilist doctrine, and of the theory of free trade. Proceeding, quote, from a purely human universal basis, end quote, Engels arrives at the correct conclusion that both doctrines must be criticized together. Engels especially exposes the hypocrisy of the liberal anti-monopolist doctrine, which pretends to be unaware that free trade is itself based upon a monopoly, namely the monopoly of private property in the hands of a minority class of society, and also that free competition inevitably leads to monopoly. The second part of the essay deals with value. This is the weakest part, where it is seen that Engels had neither understood nor gone deeper than Ricardo. Engels discusses value by starting with the distinction between, quote, abstract or real, and, quote, value on the one hand, and exchange value on the other. Engels then examines the two schools which reduce, quote, abstract value, end quote, to, quote, cost of production, end quote, and to, quote, utility, end quote, respectively. He comes to the conclusion that the, quote, intrinsic value, end quote, of an object, quote, includes both factors, end quote, cost of production and utility. In a passage which, to be sure, is not very clear, he seems to cast doubt on the very existence of value. Engels comes nearer to a correct view when Engels criticizes the working of the, quote, law of competition, end quote, which operates as a, quote, purely natural law, end quote, and he deduces the appearance of overproduction crises precisely from the working of this law, that is, from competition. The piece ends with a fierce polemic against Malthus's, quote, law of population, end quote, and a description of the disastrous consequences of large-scale industry for a substantial section of the population. This is the most impressive part. It takes up and carries further the critique of capitalism made by Fourier, and it was in turn to be extended and supported by remarkable documentation in Engels' first book, The Condition of the Working Class in England. It is true that in the final part of the piece we still find some mistakes, such as the idea that the worker's wage is reduced to the means of subsistence and nothing more. But the criticism of Malthus is lucid and sets forth the essential argument that remains valid to this day in the dispute with Neo-Malthusianism, namely that it is fallacious to compare the increase in population with the increase in the natural production of the soil. It should rather be compared with the potential increase in agricultural productivity that would result from the effective application of modern science and technique to agriculture. I'm going to repeat that whole sentence because there's a lot of italics in it. But the criticism of Malthus is lucid and sets forth the essential argument that remains valid to this day in the dispute with Neo-Malthusianism, namely that it is fallacious to compare the increase in population with the increase in the natural production of the soil. It should rather be compared with the potential increase in agricultural productivity that would result from the effective application of modern science and technique to agriculture. The analysis of overproduction crises as a fundamental expression of the contradictions of capitalism is striking in its conciseness and in the young writer's ability to get to the bottom of things. Footnote. Engels calls Malthus's population theory a, quote, vile, infamous theory, end quote, a, quote, revolting blasphemy against nature and mankind, end quote. Engels. End footnote. Overproduction leads to the exposure of a senseless and absurd situation. People dying of hunger in the midst of plenty. Above all, in his essay, Engels brings together the critique of private property, which had occupied the two future friends for 2 years, and the critique of capitalism, which was to be their concern for the rest of their lives, by stating that the division between capital and labor results inevitably from private property. The division between capital and labor results inevitably from private property, and that this division leads to the division of bourgeois society into opposing classes, to the division of mankind into capitalists and workers. As a side note, I believe in Marx's 1844 manuscripts, he says something opposite, that the division between capital and labor, the alienate, which I don't know, capital is too concrete of a concept, I think, at this point to be talking about, but the separation between direct producers and the means of production is the precondition for private property and not vice versa. Or something like that in the economic manuscripts of 1844. But that's just me going off memory. I'm not precise on that. So take what I say for granted there. Don't take what I say for granted there. The immoral and inhuman consequences of capitalism, of large-scale industry, the way in which it breaks up the family and causes an increase in crime, which are noted in a few striking phrases in the outlines, in which the Communist Manifesto was to describe in a grim, unforgettable word picture, were analyzed more fully in a work which remains to this day the most moving depiction of the social consequences of the Industrial Revolution. Footnote. D.I. Rosenberg notes that in Briefe aus dem Wuppertal, Letters from Wuppertal, a work written when he was only 19, Engels was already struck by the workers' inhuman working conditions, quote, which must deprive them of all the joy of living, end quote. I don't know if that quote's from Engels or from Rosenberg. End footnote. The condition of the working class in England is not a work of historical materialism in the strict sense. The condition of the working class in England is still moral indignation rather than understanding of the social process that inspires the young social critic. But this moral indignation is already revolutionary, already linked to a boundless devotion to the class exploited and crushed by capital, the class which has created all that wealth whose enjoyment capital reserves to capital's self. Most important, the book already leads to the realization that the actual struggle of the proletariat is the only possible vehicle for socialism. Most important, the book already leads to the realization that the actual struggle of the proletariat is the only possible vehicle for socialism. In this sense, it marked Engels' definite break with utopian socialism and forms at the same time an essential weapon against it. In recent years, this conception has been subjected to critical examination because of the obvious historical delay in the victory of socialism in the industrially developed countries of the West. Some of the critics, either explicitly, as with Frantz Fanon, or implicitly, as with the theoreticians of the Chinese Communist Party, strive to show that the revolutionary potential of the peoples of the Third World is greater than that of the Western proletariat. Moreover, within the peoples of the Third World, they assign the chief role in the revolution to the peasantry and the revolutionary intelligentsia, and consider that in those countries, the industrial proletariat is to some extent a privileged social class in relation to the landless peasants. Footnote. See, for instance, Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. Other critics question not the revolutionary capacity of the Western proletariat in comparison with that of the peoples of the Third World, but its revolutionary capacity as such. They regard the Western proletariat as being in practice integrated into capitalist society, especially through its atomization, in semi-automated industry, the growth in its consuming capacity, and the opportunities that exist for manipulating its ideology and its needs. Footnote. See, for instance, Herbert Marcuse. See also Paul A. Berlin and Paul M. Sweezy, Monopoly Capital, and C. Wright Mills, The Marxists. End footnote. They do not deny that the mass of those who are obliged to sell their labor power continue to increase both in absolute numbers and relative to the total population. They do deny that this numerical increase strengthens either directly or indirectly the challenge to Western capitalism, or even the likelihood of seeing it overthrown by the Western proletariat. Both types of critic tend to refer more often to the youthful writings of Marx and Engels than to the writings of their mature years. In these youthful works, and in particular in the introduction to the critique of the Hegelian philosophy of right, the revolutionary role of the proletariat is essentially deduced from the negative characteristics of this class in bourgeois society. It is presented as the culmination of a Hegelian triad, as a veritable, quote, negation of the negation, end quote. It is because the proletariat's chains are radical that it can get rid of them only through a radical revolution. This leads contemporary critics to conclude that since the proletariat's chains have today become a great deal less radical, the hope of a radical revolution being carried out by this class has become largely utopian. A more critical analysis of the youthful writings of Marx and Engels, and especially of the origin of their ideas regarding social revolution, shows, however, that behind the brilliant style there was still at that stage a lack of empirical knowledge. A remark Engels formulated 40 years later, writing about the German ideology, applies equally to the famous phrase about, quote, radical chains, end quote. Quote, the finished portion consists of an exposition of the materialist conception of history, which proves only how incomplete our knowledge of economic history still was at that time, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach, and the End of Classical German Philosophy. End footnote. The modern proletariat is not, in fact, the social class which was born the heaviest chains in the history of the world. That definition would better fit the Roman slaves between the 1st century BC and 3rd century AD. And you could say that about, I don't know, I think never mind, doesn't matter. That definition would better fit the Roman slaves between 1st century BC and 3rd century AD. History has shown that it is not enough for a class to have nothing more to lose and not to possess private property for it to be capable of carrying out a social revolution abolishing all private property. When they later made their diagnosis more precise, Marx and Engels assigned the proletariat the key role in the coming of socialism, not so much because of the misery it suffers, as because of the place it occupies in the production process and the capacity it thereby possesses to acquire a talent for organization and a cohesion in action which is incommensurable with that of any oppressed class in the past. There is no reason to deny the revolutionary capacity of the landless peasantry of the countries of the Third World, or to doubt the fact that these countries have brought forward the largest number of participants in the revolutionary struggle on the world scale during the past 20 years. 2 points need to be made, however, if this fact is not to be transformed into a false picture of the overall reality. First, this peasantry, as the Marxists foresaw, is in itself unable to take power and found new states. For this, it needs a leadership which by origin... First, this peasantry, as the Marxists foresaw, is in itself unable to take power and found new states. For this, it needs a leadership which by origin, composition, and inspiration is proletarian. Footnote, see Leon Trotsky, Die Russische Revolution, 1905. And there's a quote here from Lenin. Quote, "These fundamental economic facts explain why this force cannot manifest itself through its own efforts, and why it has failed in all its attempts to do so in the history of all revolutions. Whenever the proletariat was unable to lead the revolution, this force always followed the leadership of the bourgeoisie," end quote. I wonder how that relates to Lenin's what is to be done about the necessity of bourgeois leadership. Leadership by bourgeois intellectuals to educate the masses who are incapable on their own of ascending beyond trade union consciousness. And that quote was from a speech to the All-Russian Congress of Transport Workers, March 27th, 1921, which is the same month that the Kronstadt Rebellion was put down. See also the Second Declaration of Havana. And footnote. Further, this poor peasantry alone is unable to build a socialist society in the sense that Marx understood it. That is a society which ensures a full and complete blossoming of all human potentialities. It is precisely because the infrastructure of such a society can only be the product of modern large-scale industry brought to its highest level of development that the socialist revolution, conceived as a worldwide process, though it may begin in underdeveloped countries, cannot be completed, that is, assume its full development until it embraces the countries that are most industrially advanced. Footnote, Marx, quote, "Empirically, communism is only possible as the act of the dominant peoples, quote, all at once," end quote, and simultaneously, which presupposes the universal development of productive forces and the world intercourse bound up with communism, end quote. Marx, The German Ideology, end footnote. Let me reread that last sentence. It's precisely because the infrastructure of such a society can only be the product of modern large-scale industry brought to its highest level of development that the socialist revolution, conceived as a worldwide process, though it may begin in underdeveloped countries, cannot be completed, that is, assume its full development, until it embraces the countries that are most industrially advanced. Furthermore, when various sociologists and economists express doubt as to the role of the proletariat as the vehicle of socialist transformation in the West, they usually make one of two mistakes. They either presuppose Marx guilty of alleging an automatic relationship between the degree of industrial development and the degree of class consciousness, or they consider the development of this class consciousness and in general the subjective conditions needed for the overthrow of capitalism as proceeding in a straight line fashion. Footnote, quote, he, Marx, seems to believe that the class consciousness is a necessary psychological consequence of objective economic development, which includes the polarization of owners and workers, end quote. C. Wright Mills, the Marxists. End footnote. It is obvious that when Marx and Engels reached maturity, they clearly grasped the dialectical relationship between the level of development of the productive forces and that of class consciousness. Footnote, see the preface written by Engels in 1892 to the English edition of The Condition of the Working Class in England. End footnote. What Engels wrote about the British proletariat of the 19th century applies, mutatis mutandis, to the American proletariat of the 20th century. In order to show that the latter will prove unable to fulfill its revolutionary mission, it is not enough to describe the present mechanisms of integration, ideological manipulation, and so on. It is necessary to show that the factors which, in the long run, work in the opposite direction, increasing international competition, which operates to erode the American monopoly on high productivity and the superiority in wages that the American workers enjoy as a result of this monopoly, will not alter the behavior of the proletariat of the United States. It is above all necessary to show that automation, which is merely the most radical form assumed by the historical tendency of capital to substitute dead labor for living labor, will in the long run be accompanied by full employment and not lead to recessions that growing inflation will be unable to hold in check. This has not yet been shown. Footnote. Baran and Sweezy show that between 1950 and 1962, the number of unskilled workers in the United States was reduced from 13 million to 4 million as a result of automation. End footnote. As to the hope of seeing the emancipating role of the proletariat carried out by, quote, unintegrated minorities, and, quote, radical minority groups, students, the infra-proletariat, or even elements which are plainly antisocial, this comes up against the same obstacle in which the slave revolts of ancient Rome stumbled and fell. These groups are capable at best of desperate outbreaks. They do not possess either objective social power, either to ensure or to paralyze production as a whole, or the lasting ability to organize themselves collectively, or the lasting ability to, two characteristics which are necessary if they are to transform present-day society. We shall see later that Marx and Engels quickly became convinced that the objective and subjective conditions favorable to the overthrow of capitalism do not develop in a straight line, but follow a curve which is distinctly influenced by the fluctuations of the industrial cycle, both the 7-year cycle and the long-term cycle. What is essential is not to know whether or not the working class of a particular country or group of countries is temporarily passive, but to know whether the objective and subjective conditions under which it lives impel it periodically to take the road of a general challenge to the capitalist order. The objective conditions for such a challenge are those that result from the very functioning of capitalism. In particular, the regulation of wages by means of the industrial reserve army, the resulting insecurity, the inadequacy of wages in relation to the needs aroused by social circumstances, the alienating nature of work, and so on. The subjective conditions are, in the last analysis, those which cause the worker to regard his situation as inferior and unsatisfactory. A mass of recent publications shows that this is true in the society called the, quote, consumers' society, unquote, no less than in the 19th century. Footnote. See, for instance, A. Andrew and J. Lignon, I don't know. Le ouvrier d'aujourd'hui, Hans Paul Barth, Walter Dirks, and others in M. Feuerzenger's edited volume Gibt es noch ein Proletariat, etc. An amusing example from Britain was recently reported by Robin Blackburn, a sociologist who devoted a study to the attitude of workers in the Vauxhall factory at Luton toward the management of the firm. 70% of those who worked in the assembly department revealed a, quote, cooperative attitude, unquote. Hardly a month after the publication of the study, there was a veritable revolt in this very plant, directed precisely against this same management. See Robin Blackburn's article, The Unequal Society, published in Robin Blackburn and Alexander Cockburn's book, The Incompatibles, Trade Union Militancy and the Consensus. End footnote. And that is the end of Chapter 1 of Ernest Mandel's The Formation of the Economic Thought of Karl Marx, 1843 to Capital, translated by Brian Pierce. Thank you so much for listening.